For most of human history, people did not sleep through the night. Instead, they slept in two distinct shifts, a first sleep and a second sleep. The first sleep would typically begin as night fell, around 8 or 9 p.m., and after a period of wakefulness, the second sleep would follow, sometimes well into the early hours of the morning. This pattern, called biphasic or segmented sleep, was a universal part of human life across many cultures and centuries. As the fire in the hearth began to dim, the world would grow very still. The smell of smoke hung faintly in the air, mixing with the quiet hum of the dark countryside. Outside, the sounds of the night, the distant calls of animals, the occasional rustle of leaves, all seemed to fade, leaving only the soft silence of a world without electricity. This was the night. This was the world before the modern idea of sleep took hold. We're going to spend the next few hours in that world. Nighttime, before artificial light, was something entirely different. It wasn't simply the absence of daylight. It was a time that carried its own weight. Darkness enveloped homes like a physical presence. For most of history, after the sunset, the world sank into near complete darkness. For those who couldn't afford candles or oil lamps, the hours between dusk and dawn were spent in a kind of half-light, the flicker of fire being the only source of warmth or illumination. The very absence of light shaped the way people lived. In those early hours, people retired to bed much earlier than we do now, usually around 8 or 9 p.m. It was not simply the setting of the sun that dictated this, but the absence of other distractions. There were no glowing screens, no bustling nightlife, no flickering lights keeping people awake into the early hours. People were simply tired when darkness fell, and the weight of the night drew them into sleep. The hours after sunset, often stretching well beyond what we might consider late today, were spent in near total quiet. Candles were expensive, and so was oil for lamps. Most homes were illuminated by a simple fire, a hearth with low flames that provided a sense of warmth, but not much in the way of light. The flicker of the fire would dance on the walls, casting shadows that grew longer as the night stretched on. The fire, while soothing, was never constant. It needed attention. The hearth would require frequent tending. A log thrown on to maintain the warmth. Embers stirred, the flames coaxed into life once more. Yet, despite this, the home became quieter as the hours passed. People would retire to their beds, often together, especially in the colder months. A single room was often shared by the entire family, and the beds were simple, sometimes little more than straw mattresses. The bed was not just a place of sleep, but a shared space where people found comfort, warmth, and sometimes solace from the chill of the night air. The act of going to bed was not hurried. It was part of the rhythm of the evening. In rural areas, the last duties of the day were completed before the fire was banked down. There was time for slow conversation, quiet reflection, or simply the sense of being together in the dark. It was a time when a family could quietly gather by the fire for a final moment of connection, just before the quiet of sleep took over. These were not the hurried moments of modern life, when we rush to check the time, keep one eye on a screen, or attend to the endless responsibilities that demand our attention. Once the fire flickered lower, people would slip into their beds. The warmth of shared bodies would be felt under the covers, a quiet protection from the cold of the world outside. The blankets might be rough, perhaps woolen, but they carried the scent of the day's work, the smells of earth, of animals, and the touch of home. There was little in the way of comfort as we think of it today, but the bed was a refuge, and it was as close to warmth and security as anyone needed. The sounds of the home would fade as the house settled into stillness, and then, in the dark, sleep would come. But it was never meant to last the entire night. The fire would burn low. The night would pass in pieces. For most people, sleep came in two stages. The first sleep, which began shortly after the fire dimmed, was just the beginning of a much longer night. It was a simpler sleep, a lighter rest, often punctuated by the sounds of creaking wood or distant animals. The house itself seemed to sleep with them, groaning in the cool quiet. For some, the first sleep would last a couple of hours. It wasn't the deep, long sleep we think of today. Instead, it was the prelude to a more profound sleep that would come later, after a time of wakefulness. People would awaken after some hours, perhaps around midnight, and for a time, the house would remain still again. The sounds of the night outside would fill the air once more, and the world would feel far away. The quiet of the world would seem heavier, more complete, as if the night were holding its breath. Some people would simply turn over and drift back to sleep. Others might sit up in bed for a time, think, or perhaps get up for a moment before returning to rest. They weren't restless, but rather attuned to the natural flow of the night, where sleep and wakefulness alternated in harmony. The night felt long, not in a tedious sense, but in a more organic way, as though it was meant to be savoured, lived in rather than rushed through. The fire would be dying by then, the glow less constant, but still present enough to cast a dim light across the room. The night air, now colder, would settle over the room. Silence would reclaim the space once again, and yet it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet that comes with a rhythm, a kind of peaceful agreement that the night would not be hurried. No clocks ticked away the minutes. No. Electric light pushed the world forward. Everything was in its natural order, a pattern passed down for generations. The smell of the fire still lingered in the air, soft, smoky. The world outside, silent, still. Time, in its own way, was taking its course. The house was quiet now, and it would remain so for a time. The first sleep was an integral part of the natural rhythm of the night, a quiet and peaceful transition into rest after a day's work. It was marked by the fading warmth of the fire, the coolness of the evening air, and the soft surrender of the body into a kind of gentle drowsiness. For most people, this sleep would last for about an hour or two, depending on the season and household. In the absence of modern clocks, there was no rush, no urgency. The first sleep came in its own time, as naturally as the setting of the sun. The rhythm of the night was shaped by the absence of artificial light, by the darkness that enveloped the home once the sun disappeared. The fire in the hearth would flicker and crackle as the last embers glowed, casting warm shadows on the walls, creating a quiet, soft cocoon in which people would begin to settle. Often, it was not a single person in a bed, but rather several, a family, or sometimes even friends and neighbours, sharing the warmth and space. The bed was small and practical, a simple refuge from the cold night air, but it was also a shared place of comfort, of connection. The act of going to bed was a slow and deliberate one. People didn't rush to sleep as we might today. There was no clock to check, no modern distractions to keep one awake. It was, in its own way, a natural pause, an interlude before the deeper rest that would come later. The ritual of settling into bed was not rushed, but savoured in its own quiet way. Whether it was a prayer or a whispered word of comfort between people in the bed, the transition into sleep was often punctuated by small moments of intimacy and reflection. The blankets, often simple and woolen, would be pulled up to cover the body. The warmth of the covers and the body heat of others around you would bring comfort and security. It wasn't the solitude we think of in modern bedrooms, but rather a sense of shared presence. The sounds of the world outside would begin to fade, and the last crackling of the fire would echo softly through the room, slowly settling into a quiet lull. As people settled in, the first sleep wasn't about sinking immediately into a deep, restful slumber. Instead, it was a kind of in-between state, a drifting away from the wakeful world. Sleep would come in waves, and the sensation of dozing off wasn't the hurried, restless tossing and turning we associate with sleeplessness today, but rather a quiet surrender to the pull of the night. The body would relax, and the mind would follow, but the sleep was light, often interrupted by brief awakenings or shifting positions. It wasn't a time to be deeply unconscious, just a time to rest and prepare for the second sleep that would follow. Many people at the time didn't consider this first sleep to be an interruption of the night, but a natural part of it. The first sleep was not the end of the day, but merely its beginning. It was a gentle, liminal sleep, more a transition between the bustling hours of the day and the deeper, slower rest that would come later. For some, the first sleep was marked by the sounds of distant animals or the creaking of wood in the house. The house itself would settle in the quiet darkness, its own rhythm blending with the soft breath of the people lying in it. Sometimes there would be a slight chill in the air, a coolness that crept in as the fire began to fade. People would shift beneath the covers, tucking themselves in tighter against the cold, feeling the warmth of the body beside them. These small shifts and adjustments were part of the rhythm of the first sleep, a kind of dance between comfort and discomfort, between rest and wakefulness. The fire may have burned lower, but its glow was still present, casting shadows that danced across the walls, keeping the night from feeling entirely dark and impenetrable. The sounds of the first sleep were often subtle, the occasional turning of a body in bed, the quiet exhale of a breath as one person slowly drifted off, the low murmur of someone still awake, perhaps thinking or whispering softly. There was no rush to sleep, no need to hurry into the deep rest that was to come. People took their time with it. The first sleep was something that would naturally follow the quiet moments of the evening, like the settling of the world itself. Once the room grew darker and the sounds of the world outside began to fade into the distance, sleep would come more easily. For some, it was the warmth of the fire that held them close, and for others, it was the simple act of lying still, listening to the night's deepening silence. The air was cool, but there was a comfort in knowing the second sleep awaited. It was a reassuring thought, a promise of a deeper rest that would follow once the first sleep had taken its course. The first sleep was never meant to last forever. It was only the beginning of the night's rhythm, the first phase in a longer period of rest. It was not a time for profound dreams or deep unconsciousness, but rather a moment to rest, to pause, to breathe. It was a quiet, simple part of the cycle, a natural break in the long stretch of hours between dusk and dawn. Once the first sleep had passed, the room would be still again. The fire would burn low, and the silence would deepen. For those who woke in the quiet hours, there would be a brief moment of clarity, a space where time didn't seem to exist. It was the time between the two sleeps, a time that felt both suspended and full, as if the world were quietly waiting for the second sleep to take over. The house, now fully settled, would hold its breath for a while longer. Evidence of biphasic sleep or segmented sleep can be traced far back in history. Across cultures, from the ancient Greeks to the Romans and Egyptians, references to this two-phase pattern of rest appear in various forms. Though the practice was widespread, it wasn't always recorded in the same way we might expect today, with clear terms or scientific explanations. Instead, ancient texts offer glimpses of a world where sleep was a more flexible and organic experience. In Homer's Odyssey, for instance, there are subtle references to the idea of two sleeps. While the word first sleep or second sleep is not explicitly used, the notion of segmented rest is clear. In the epic, characters are often described as waking during the night, before returning to their beds later. This is not the modern idea of insomnia, but rather a natural wakefulness between two periods of sleep. The first sleep, often a lighter, more fragmented rest, would give way to a deeper, more sustained sleep later in the night. Roman writers also provide evidence of biphasic sleep. The historian and philosopher Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, refers to people waking in the middle of the night, calling it a common habit in his time. He writes of it almost matter-of-factly, as though it was simply part of the natural order of things. The practice was so widely accepted that it didn't require much explanation. The term first sleep is not used, but the description of sleep as divided into two parts is clear enough. In fact, Roman doctors were particularly keen on the idea of segmented sleep. They understood that people would often awaken after the first phase of sleep and lie in the dark for a time before drifting back to a deeper rest. This wasn't considered problematic, but rather a natural feature of sleep, something beneficial even. It was believed that waking in the middle of the night gave the body a chance to refresh itself, prepare for the deeper phase of rest to follow. In Egypt, there was also evidence of segmented sleep, though it appeared in a different form. Ancient Egyptian texts reference a watch during the night. This period of wakefulness between two sleeps was often spent in prayer or contemplation. There are even mentions of how people would wake in the night, offer quiet prayers, and then return to sleep, suggesting that this was a time both of spiritual reflection and physical rest. The Egyptians, like the Romans, seemed to understand that rest could come in phases, and that these phases contributed to the quality of sleep. In Mesopotamian culture, evidence of this sleep pattern is found in the form of night prayers, many of which were timed to occur at the midpoint of the night. These prayers often coincided with the natural waking point during the first sleep. In ancient Mesopotamia, the night was seen not as a singular, uninterrupted period of sleep, but as a sequence of phases, one of which involved waking up, offering prayers, and then returning to a deeper rest. These rituals weren't just limited to the elite or the educated, but were part of daily life for many people. The evidence suggests that these practices were so ingrained in the culture that they weren't questioned. They were simply accepted as part of the natural course of the night. People would wake after their first sleep, as if on cue, and engage in some form of quiet activity, often spiritual or reflective in nature. It wasn't a time of anxiety or restlessness. It was a time of peaceful pause before the body drifted back into a deeper, more restorative rest. By the time we move into medieval Europe, we find that the pattern of first and second sleep was already well established. In fact, references to the first sleep and second sleep appear in court documents, medical texts, and even diaries. There are records of people referring to these stages of sleep as if they were universally understood, without needing further explanation. A person's first sleep was expected to be light and brief, while the second sleep was reserved for a deeper, more restorative rest. The ancient world, with its varied cultures, shared something fundamental when it came to sleep. The understanding that the night was divided. Sleep was not simply a continuous stretch of unconsciousness, but rather a rhythm that naturally unfolded over several hours. The evidence is scattered, but is clear. The segmented sleep pattern was not only a reality in the ancient world, it was part of the daily lives of people across the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. As the fire slowly died down and the room became still, imagine someone, somewhere in the ancient world, awake in the dark. They are not afraid. They are simply awake, resting, and waiting for sleep to return once more. There is no hurry, no anxiety. The night is long, and it is part of the natural rhythm of life. As we move into the medieval period, the pattern of segmented sleep remains consistent, yet we begin to see clearer documentation of this practice. By this time, biphasic sleep was so ingrained in daily life that it didn't require special mention in many texts. People simply slept in two phases, and this pattern was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. It was just how the night unfolded. Historical records from medieval Europe, particularly those studied by historian Roger Ekirch, show that the concept of first sleep and second sleep was understood widely and even used in legal and medical contexts. The terms themselves appear in wills, court documents, and diaries, often without explanation, as though everyone was already familiar with the idea. It was simply accepted as a natural part of life. The watch, as it was called, was a deliberate and understood period of wakefulness that occurred between the two sleeps. This watch lasted roughly 1 to 2 hours, a time when people were neither fully awake nor fully asleep, suspended in a peaceful limbo between rest and wakefulness. The night was divided by this period of quiet reflection, the body having already drifted into the first sleep, then gently waking in the middle of the night. At this point, the house would be silent again, the fire dimming and casting only faint light against the walls. This quiet, awake period could be filled with a variety of activities, depending on the person and their household. For some, it was a time for prayer or reflection, a way to connect with their inner thoughts or their faith. Others might have used the time for quiet, intimate conversation with their spouse, or simply to listen to the night outside. There was a stillness to this time, a calmness. People often did not rise from their beds, but lay quietly, simply waiting for the second sleep to take them. The hours between the two sleeps were not marked by anxiety or restlessness. On the contrary, it was a time expected by all. The house was calm, the fire barely alive, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The activity of the medieval watch could take many forms, depending on individual customs. Some people, particularly in rural areas, may have used the time to tend to small tasks. It was not uncommon for someone to get up briefly to make sure the fire didn't die out completely, or to check that the animals were settled in for the night. But these were simple, quiet actions, done with care but without hurry. In a family home, it wasn't unusual for multiple people to wake at different times. One person might rise for a brief moment to stretch their limbs, while others remained still, slipping back into their own dreams. The atmosphere of these households was tranquil, undisturbed by clocks or the rush of time. The night simply unfolded in its own rhythm, and the watch, however brief, was an accepted part of that rhythm. It's important to note that this period of wakefulness, this quiet watch, wasn't seen as disruptive. It wasn't the restless tossing and turning we associate with insomnia today. Instead, it was part of the natural cycle of the night. This waking time was not driven by the desire to do something, but rather by the body's own rhythm. People awoke not because they were uncomfortable, but because their bodies naturally followed this cycle of light and deep sleep. The moment of wakefulness was more like a gentle pause, allowing for a brief reflection on the night, or simply a peaceful moment of quiet in the dark. By the time the second sleep would begin, the house would have settled back into complete stillness. The fire would have burned low, perhaps leaving only the faintest glow in the hearth. The temperature in the room would have dropped slightly, and the sounds of the night outside would fill the quiet once more. The house would be cold, but the body would be warm beneath the blankets, and the second sleep would follow naturally, its depth and peacefulness a return to full rest. The transition between the first and second sleep was slow and natural. After waking from the first sleep, it was not uncommon to simply drift back into a deeper rest without any effort. The body's need for full sleep was still unmet, and so it would continue its natural rhythm. The night was long, and there was no rush to get to morning. And in the stillness of the room, with the fire long gone and the silence absolute, the second sleep would begin. The quiet moments between the two sleeps were not merely a time of waiting. They were, in fact, an integral part of the night, filled with small, meaningful activities. While the first sleep was a gentle transition into rest, and the second sleep a deeper, more restorative phase, the time between these two sleeps, the watch, was a time of quiet engagement. It was an hour or two that might seem barren from our modern perspective, but for those who lived it, it was filled with purpose, intimacy, and ritual. In medieval Europe, the watch was often a time of prayer. The importance of prayer during the night was deeply embedded in many cultures, especially in Christian Europe, where it was common to say prayers before sleep. Yet, the night watch added another layer to this tradition. Waking in the middle of the night, a person could pray, reflect, or offer thanks in the solitude of darkness. The time between the sleeps wasn't a time to rush through. It was a moment to slow down and connect with oneself and one's faith. For many, the first hours of the night were spent in a soft quiet, but this interlude allowed for a deeper, more personal connection with the divine. People would lie awake, the soft crackling of the dying fire filling the space, saying whispered prayers or contemplating their thoughts in a gentle, meditative silence. For others, the watch was a time for quiet, intimate conversation. A couple might lie in bed, not yet fully asleep, sharing thoughts, secrets, or small moments of affection. It was a time to talk without the distractions of the day, when the world outside seemed far away, and the warmth of the bed and the quiet of the house made conversation softer, more intimate. The silence of the night allowed for a deeper connection between people, as they found moments of peace together. The watch also provided an opportunity for quiet domestic tasks. Some people would tend to the fire, poking it to ensure it didn't die out entirely. It was a simple, calm act, done with care. The fire was, after all, the only source of light and warmth in many homes, so keeping it burning through the night was an essential task. If the fire was allowed to go out, the room would grow cold, and the darkness would become more oppressive. It was a small but important task, done in the stillness of the watch. Medieval medical texts also recommended the watch as an ideal time for conception. According to the medical beliefs of the time, the body was at its most alive, its most fertile, in the quiet, peaceful hours of the night between the two sleeps. The idea was that the body was calmer, more open during this time. For couples trying to conceive, the watch was seen as a valuable moment to engage in intimacy, taking advantage of the body's natural rhythms. Though this may seem unusual to us today, it was a common belief that the stillness of the night and the body's natural restfulness made it an ideal moment for intimacy. Beyond these rituals and activities, the watch was simply a time to pause and breathe. In a world that often demanded hard work during the day, this brief period of wakefulness allowed people to take a break from the world's constant demands. It was a time to listen to the quiet, to feel the stillness, and to appreciate the slow passage of the night. The simple act of lying in bed in the dark, with only the soft sound of the fire and the occasional rustle of movement, could feel like a refuge, a moment when the body and mind could reset before the second sleep took over. There was also a sense of quiet intimacy that came with these moments of wakefulness. Couples, families, and even friends shared the night together, not in the hurried, restless way we might imagine today, but with a sense of peace. People were not trying to stay awake or find distractions. They were simply in tune with the rhythm of the night, awake for a time, and then returning to rest. The watch wasn't a time of anxiety or restlessness. It was instead a time of tranquility. The body was rested but not fully asleep. The mind was free to wander, but it wasn't burdened with the weight of the world. In the dark, the silence held space for people to think, reflect, or simply enjoy the quiet presence of others. It's easy to imagine, in today's world of artificial lights and constant noise, how strange this might seem. But to those who lived in that time, the hours between the two sleeps were not an inconvenience, nor a source of frustration. They were simply part of the natural rhythm of life. a small, quiet interlude before the deeper rest of the second sleep. And so, as the fire faded and the house grew still, people would lay in the darkness in this calm space between wakefulness and sleep, with no urgency to hurry. They might pray, converse, or simply breathe in the quiet, knowing that soon the second sleep would come, and they could rest more deeply than before. The second sleep was not merely an extension of the first, but a deeper, more profound rest. Once the quiet watch had passed and the house settled into silence, the second sleep would come naturally, its depth a contrast to the lighter first sleep. The room would be colder, the fire dimmer, and the darkness more complete. Yet, for those who slept, this second phase of rest was deeply rejuvenating. People who had already gone through the first sleep would slip back into bed with ease. The body, having passed through the gentle wakefulness of the watch, would now be ready for the deeper, more uninterrupted sleep that was to come. The world outside was quiet, the house settled, and the time for reflection had passed. Now sleep would take over fully. The quality of the second sleep was noticeably different. Whereas the first sleep was often light and fragmented, the second sleep was deeper, more restorative. People would slip into a heavy sleep, the kind that left them unaware of the passing of time. Dreams, too, were often more vivid during the second sleep. This was the time when the mind was allowed to wander freely, when the subconscious could weave stories from the shadows of the night. Medieval dream theory, which viewed dreams as a window into the soul or a divine message, tied these dreams specifically to the second sleep. It was during these later hours of the night that people believed the mind was most active, the body most relaxed, and the dreams most vivid. In this deep sleep, people were believed to be more open to visions, messages from the divine, or even premonitions. The night held an air of mystery during the second sleep, a sense that dreams were not just random but held meaning, a sense that something important might be revealed in the darkness. The physical sensations of the second sleep were equally profound. The body, having experienced the lighter first sleep, could now fully relax. The deeper rest that followed was thought to be more restorative, as the body had already passed through a period of lighter, more intermittent rest. The warmth of the blankets, the shared heat of bodies in the bed, and the quiet of the room all contributed to this deeper sense of comfort. This sleep was not easily disturbed. The sounds of the outside world, or even the house settling further, were distant in the second sleep. The body, fully relaxed, could drift even further into its rhythm, unburdened by the demands of the waking world. The second sleep was meant to heal, to restore, and to prepare the person for the day that would eventually follow. While the fire in the hearth might have burned low and the room grown cooler, the body had no need for the fire's warmth in the second sleep. The bed itself, perhaps shared by others, carried a warmth of its own. The stillness in the house was complete. There was no ticking clock, no rush, no external force that would hurry the second sleep. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching out in the way that only the deepest sleep can. The second sleep was often described as the more peaceful of the two. It was a time of true rest. People's bodies had settled in, having passed through the first lighter sleep and the subsequent wakeful period. It was a space where the mind could be free, where dreams could be experienced without the disturbances of the world outside. For many, this was the sleep that felt most natural, undisturbed, and uninterrupted. It wasn't just a time of physical rest either. The second sleep allowed the mind to wander freely, a luxury in a time when the world was full of external demands. Dreams might be strange, vivid, or even prophetic, but they were a part of the night's natural course. The second sleep was tied not just to the body's need for rest, but to the mind's need for release. As the second sleep settled deeper, the night became stiller. The quiet of the world outside became almost palpable. Even the sounds of the animals, the wind and the distant rustle of trees seemed to fade. The fire, now almost out, left only faint embers to glow softly in the hearth. The room, darker and colder, seemed to hold its breath. Inside, those still awake or in the throes of the second sleep could rest without hurry. The slow passage of time was comforting. There was no need to rush into the waking hours. The second sleep was a pause, a long, quiet stretch of time that allowed the body to repair, the mind to dream, and the world outside to remain distant. This was a deep, full rest, the kind that, when you woke, would leave you feeling more grounded and connected to the quiet stillness of the night. The night had settled into its deepest point. The second sleep had begun, and the house was quiet again, resting deeply before the world stirred again with the first light of dawn. As we've seen in ancient Rome, Greece, Egypt, and medieval Europe, the practice of segmented sleep was not limited to any one culture. Across the world and throughout history, different societies, each with their own customs and rhythms, shared the same understanding of night divided into two distinct phases of sleep. This practice, known as biphasic or segmented sleep, appeared in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, suggesting that this was not merely a coincidence, but a deeply ingrained human rhythm. In West Africa, for instance, historical records indicate that many traditional societies also observed a form of segmented sleep. The Hausa people, in particular, had a saying that spoke of the middle hour, the period between the first and second sleep. This was understood as a time of peace, a quiet interlude that was valued as a necessary part of the night's rest. Waking in the middle of the night was not seen as a disruption, but as an expected part of the natural cycle of sleep. People in these cultures would often rise during this time, offering prayers or reflecting on their day before returning to a deeper sleep. In Japan, ancient texts also reflect this understanding of segmented sleep. Early Japanese traditions indicate that people followed a pattern similar to that of the Western world: a first sleep, followed by a waking period, and then a second, deeper sleep. It was common for people to wake up during the night to use the restroom, to engage in quiet conversation, or to simply listen to the stillness around them. The time between these two sleeps was viewed as an important opportunity for reflection or quiet interaction, before settling back into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. In indigenous North American cultures, there are also traces of segmented sleep. Many Native American tribes shared stories of waking in the middle of the night, sometimes to share quiet moments with family, sometimes to pray or reflect on dreams. The practice varied from tribe to tribe, but the general principle remained the same. The night was divided into two parts, with a natural pause between the two sleeps. This pause was not seen as an interruption, but rather as part of a larger rhythm in which the body would rest in stages, allowing for both physical rejuvenation and spiritual connection. One particularly poignant example comes from the Aztec people of Mesoamerica. Their concept of sleep was tied deeply to spiritual practices, and there are references to waking during the middle of the night to perform rituals or prayers. These moments of wakefulness were believed to be spiritually significant, as they allowed for a time of reflection and connection to the divine. The night was not a time for simple rest, but for a spiritual journey, a process that unfolded in two phases, each with its own significance. The patterns of segmented sleep that appear across the world's cultures all share one thing in common: the recognition that the night is not simply a single stretch of time. It is instead a cycle, a rhythm that flows naturally between periods of rest and brief wakefulness. The idea that waking in the middle of the night was both normal and expected appears across a wide range of cultures, even though these societies were separated by vast distances and distinct cultural practices. The common thread is the natural connection between sleep and wakefulness, the understanding that the body and mind both needed rest in phases. There was no rush to sleep straight through the night. Instead, the night was seen as a time for gradual transition, a time when the body could rest in stages, each phase building toward the next. As we consider these examples, it becomes clear that segmented sleep wasn't merely a regional anomaly. It was, for much of human history, the shared experience of people around the world. The rhythms of sleep, it seemed, were universal, a pattern shaped by the natural cycle of light and darkness, by the world's silence, and by the steady passage of time. Imagine then someone, a person in a village in West Africa perhaps, or a small town in ancient Japan, waking in the dark of night, their body naturally slipping into a brief state of wakefulness. They do not feel disturbed or restless. They simply exist in the stillness of the moment, aware of the night and their place in it. They may look out at the stars, or perhaps lie quietly, listening to the sounds of the world outside, knowing that soon they will return to their second sleep. It is a quiet, shared experience that connects them to a broader human rhythm, one that stretches across cultures and generations. And in that moment, they are not alone. Across the world, at the same time, others are waking too, just as they will, for as long as the night continues to unfold. The transition from segmented sleep to the modern, continuous sleep we know today was a gradual one, shaped by changes in society and technology. The shift didn't happen overnight, but unfolded over centuries, driven by cultural, industrial, and technological changes that began to reshape the very fabric of daily life. As the world modernized, the rhythm of the night shifted too. One of the most significant changes came with the rise of artificial light. Before the widespread availability of electric lamps, people's nights were shaped by the natural rhythms of light and darkness. Once the sun set, the world fell into darkness, and the body naturally adjusted to the limited hours of light. But as artificial lighting became more common, starting with oil lamps and later gaslights, people's ability to extend their waking hours well into the night transformed the natural cycle of sleep. In urban areas, streetlights began to push back the darkness. Cities like London and Paris, which were once enveloped in near total darkness after sunset, now began to glow with artificial light, allowing people to stay up much later than they could have in the past. This light, though a symbol of progress, began to alter the natural rhythms of rest. People were no longer as reliant on the darkness to signal the end of the day, and the rigid division between night and day began to blur. It was no longer necessary to go to bed early when the darkness of the night was dispelled by electric lights and street lamps. The Industrial Revolution also played a crucial role in this transformation. As factories and mills began to proliferate in the 18th and 19th centuries, a new, strict sense of time emerged. The factory shift, with its regular hours and the need for workers to be present at specific times, replaced the more organic rhythms of the past. People were no longer free to sleep when they felt tired, nor to wake when their bodies were ready. The clock began to govern everything, including sleep. Industrial workers were often forced into rigid schedules, waking early in the morning and working long hours under harsh conditions. The very nature of work changed, with people now waking up at the same time every day, regardless of how much sleep they had gotten. The artificial structures of time became more prominent, and this eroded the natural flow of segmented sleep. As a result, people began to sleep through the night in one uninterrupted block, whether their bodies were ready for it or not. In addition, the growing availability of clocks, accurate timepieces that allowed people to synchronize their lives with precision, further eroded the old rhythms. No longer did the night need to unfold in the quiet and gradual way it once had. People could now wake to the sound of a clock, check their watch, and structure their day accordingly. The shift to a more regimented sleep schedule was now fully underway. By the end of the 19th century, most people had abandoned the pattern of segmented sleep. Diaries, letters, and medical texts, which once discussed first and second sleep as an accepted part of life, now stopped mentioning it. The notion of waking in the middle of the night was no longer considered normal or even desirable. People had learned to sleep straight through, from the moment they went to bed until morning, driven by the ticking of clocks and the demands of factory life. Yet, while segmented sleep had largely disappeared from the daily lives of most people, it did not vanish completely. Some rural communities, where the pace of life remained slower and more attuned to the natural world, continued to practice biphasic sleep for a time. In these quieter spaces, where artificial lighting was scarce and clocks were not as prevalent, the body's natural rhythms remained undisturbed. But for the most part, the world had moved on. The natural cycle of segmented sleep was replaced by the demands of the modern world, of clock time, factory hours, and the ever-increasing desire for productivity. The quiet moments between the two sleeps, once a universally recognized part of the night, slowly faded into memory. People no longer needed to rise in the middle of the night. Their lives were now governed by the relentless march of the clock. And so, the old rhythm of the night, with its first sleep, its watch, and its second sleep, gradually disappeared from most homes. It was not so much destroyed as forgotten, overwritten by the pressures of modern life. The night became a singular stretch of time, meant to be spent entirely in rest, a silent testament to the power of industrialization, artificial light, and the clock. As the world moved forward, sleep became more continuous, more regulated. People slept in a single long stretch, no longer divided by the quiet pause in the night. But even as the habit of segmented sleep disappeared, the memory of it remained, a distant echo of a time when the night was longer, quieter, and more attuned to the natural rhythms of the world. In the late 20th century, sleep researchers began to look back at the patterns of rest that had been common in the past. The natural world, with its rhythms of light and dark, had shaped human sleep for millennia, and modern science was starting to reconsider what we had lost in our shift to continuous, uninterrupted sleep. It was during this time that the first modern studies began to suggest that segmented sleep might not just be a relic of the past, but could, in fact, be closer to our natural state than we had realized. In 1992, sleep researcher Thomas Ware conducted a groundbreaking study that would reignite interest in the concept of biphasic sleep. Ware's experiment involved placing participants in a controlled environment where artificial light was removed, and they were allowed to follow the natural cycle of light and dark. The results were surprising. After several weeks of exposure to natural light, the participants began to fall into the same segmented sleep pattern that had been common for centuries. Ware observed that participants naturally divided their sleep into two phases, with an initial period of lighter sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then a deeper second sleep. The findings were striking. It suggested that our bodies still remembered this ancient pattern of rest, even after generations of living with artificial light. Segmented sleep, it seemed, might not be an abnormality or a relic of the past, but rather a default setting, a natural way for humans to sleep when removed from the constraints of modern life. The implications of Ware's study were profound. It suggested that the way we sleep today, a single continuous block of rest, might not be the ideal way for the body to recover and rejuvenate. In fact, it might even be unnatural. Modern sleep researchers began to wonder if the segmented sleep pattern was not only more natural, but also healthier. The first phase of sleep, lighter and more easily disturbed, might have served a biological purpose. It allowed for brief moments of wakefulness in which people could check on their surroundings, engage in quiet activities, or even connect with loved ones during a time of peace and solitude. The second sleep, deeper and more restorative, would follow naturally after the watch. This deeper rest could offer the body and mind the full recuperation they needed, without the interference of artificial light or external pressures. The quiet, brief period between the two phases could allow for mental and physical reset, promoting a healthier cycle of rest. Modern sleep scientists began to wonder if the pressures of modern life, the constant presence of artificial light, the rigidity of industrial work schedules, and the endless demands of technology had thrown off our natural sleep rhythms. As research into sleep deepened, it became clear that the quality of sleep was just as important as the quantity, and segmented sleep might offer a model of rest that was more attuned to our biological needs. The idea of biphasic sleep began to gain traction in modern sleep circles. Studies showed that people who lived in environments that mimicked natural cycles of light and dark, such as those without electricity or in rural areas, often followed segmented sleep patterns without effort. The absence of artificial light allowed for the natural rhythm of the night to take hold. People woke in the middle of the night and fell back to sleep with ease, experiencing a deep and restorative second sleep. In the years following their study, additional research supported the idea that segmented sleep was not only natural, but beneficial. Modern sleep experts began to argue that we might be better off embracing a more flexible approach to sleep, one that acknowledged the body's natural rhythm and allowed for rest in two phases. This new perspective on sleep invited us to reconsider what we thought we knew about the ideal sleep cycle and encouraged a return to practices that had been lost over the centuries. And so, the study of sleep circled back to the ancient world, where biphasic sleep was once the norm. The research revealed that despite the centuries of industrialization, artificial light, and clock-driven time, our bodies still carried the memory of this ancient rhythm. The research did not bring back segmented sleep for most people, but it did change the way we thought about rest. It reminded us that the rhythms of nature still had a place in our modern lives, and that perhaps, if we listened carefully enough, we could reclaim some of the wisdom of the past. As people continued to work long hours under the glare of artificial light, the study of sleep became an important tool in understanding how to find balance in a world that had, in many ways, forgotten the natural rhythms of rest. The research suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was more to sleep than simply a long stretch of uninterrupted hours. There was, after all, wisdom in the way people once slept, in the quiet hours between the two sleeps. The night, once long and divided, has mostly disappeared from our modern lives, but the memory of those old rhythms lingers. Today, the night is one continuous stretch, a single, uninterrupted block of sleep that many of us take for granted. The quiet moments between the two sleeps, the watch, the second sleep, all of it feels like a distant memory, a piece of history that is no longer part of the everyday world. Yet, if we slow down and listen carefully, we can still feel the echoes of those old rhythms. Imagine now for a moment a house before the modern era. The fire, now long gone, has left only a few glowing embers, the last remnants of warmth from the night before. The room is dark, cold, and still, but the silence is not unsettling. It's a familiar kind of silence, the kind that blankets the earth when the world has no other sound but its own breath. The night is deep, but it is not lonely. It holds its own quiet peace. The first sleep, which has already come and gone, was light, a gentle drifting from wakefulness into a deeper rest. But now the time has passed, and the second sleep is upon the house. Those awake for the watch might be feeling their body's quiet shift, the world outside remaining still and untouched. There is no hurry to drift back to sleep, no pressure to fill the space with noise. The second sleep arrives slowly, almost as if it too is waiting to fully settle. In that stillness, people slept, or they woke, as they often did. They didn't feel disturbed, only attuned to the natural rhythm of the night, where the first sleep faded into a quiet pause, and the second sleep followed. They woke, perhaps to pray, perhaps to converse in hushed tones, perhaps simply to breathe in the stillness before the deep rest of the second sleep took hold. What might it have been like those moments between the two sleeps? Was it a brief time of solitude, or a space for shared connection with others in the house? In some homes, this time was marked by small rituals. Prayers were said in the quiet dark, whispered softly. Words might have been exchanged, not rushed, but gently spoken in the soft language of night. The fire might have been tended, but always with care, with time. These quiet actions were part of the peaceful ritual that filled the hours between the two sleeps. The rhythms of sleep that we have today, continuous and unbroken, feel normal to us. But for those who lived in the past, their night was a different world. It was one that unfolded in two parts, each with its own space, its own time, and its own purpose. The quiet between the sleeps was a pause, a moment to reflect, to connect, and to rest, before the body drifted back into deeper sleep. It was a natural, peaceful way of being, unhurried and without pressure, where the passing of time was not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the natural cycle of light and darkness. In those ancient homes, sleep was woven into the fabric of the night. It was not merely a time to rest, but a part of a shared experience, one that passed through two phases. The fire flickered low, and the room, still dark, offered both peace and security. People drifted in and out of sleep, not in a rush, but in time with the natural world. There were no distractions, no outside pressures, and no need to fill the silence. The stillness of the night was its own companion. For those who woke, the experience was shared. The night was not spent in solitude, even when the house was quiet. The bodies in the bed, close together for warmth, felt the same rhythms, each person's rest interwoven with the others. The quiet hours between sleeps were not a time of loneliness, but of togetherness, a peaceful pause in which the world outside seemed distant, held far away by the walls of the house and the warmth of the blankets. As the night passed, the second sleep began. The body, now fully relaxed, would fall into deeper rest. The mind, having been allowed to roam in the watch, now sank fully into the sleep that followed. The dreams, more vivid than those of the first sleep, would come more naturally. The body and mind were both at ease, moving through the rhythms of the night, unhurried and without disruption. The fire that had burned low, now almost out, left only the faintest glow. The room, colder now, seemed to embrace the deep stillness that had overtaken it. The night was quiet, full of its own weight, as the second sleep settled in. There was no rush to the morning. There was only the silence, the coolness of the room, and the deepening rest of the second sleep. It was during these quiet hours that people truly rested. The deep, uninterrupted sleep that followed the watch was a time to restore the body, to reset the mind, and to breathe deeply into the natural rhythms of life. The night was long, not in the sense of being tedious, but long in the way that only a full night's rest can feel. The hours of sleep seemed to stretch out, unmarked by clocks, unmeasured by the rush of time. The world, outside the home, remained silent. The stars above remained unchanged. The wind blew softly, but all was still. The night held its breath, waiting for morning, as people slept deeply in the warmth of their beds. And when morning finally came, as the sun began to rise and the light returned, the rhythm of the night would dissolve, returning to the waking world. But for those who had experienced the still hours, the night would have left its imprint on their bodies and minds. It would have shaped their sleep, their dreams, and their memories. And so, as the last echoes of the past fade, we return to the present. The world is quiet, the house still. The fire, long gone, has left only the memory of its warmth. The darkness is deep, and time once again slows to a stop. In this silence, the body rests, and the mind finds its place in the night. The world sleeps, and so we do.